Hello, everybody. My name is David Wood, and I chair London Futurists. We're living in serious times. It was reported yesterday in the UK that 980 people had died from COVID-19 in the preceding 24 hours. That's a lot more than the typical death rate from flu. It's significantly more than the average daily deaths from cancer in the UK, which is around 450. And it's the same with heart disease and circulatory diseases. They kill on average around 460 people per day. Similar large death rates from COVID-19 are being reported around the world. And worse, there are few signs yet of the death rate in the UK having reached a peak, although there may be some more encouraging signs elsewhere in the world. Things are serious, not only in terms of people dying, but in terms of an economic recession. Huge numbers of people are seeing large drops in their incomes. Businesses of all sizes are shutting down. The IMF has forecast the worst global economic crisis since the Great Depression of the early 1930s. As I said, we're living in serious times. But we're also living in uncertain times. There's a great deal of uncertainty ahead. We're uncertain about the likely future COVID death statistics. We're uncertain about exit strategies from the lockdown policies in place around the world. We're uncertain about the effectiveness of different measures to respond to such a pandemic. And we're uncertain about how society might organize itself in a post-COVID world. The goal of today's London Futurists webinar is to start to give some shape to that uncertainty. What are the key axes of uncertainty for the landscape of post-COVID scenarios? You'll be hearing some predictions and analysis from the panelists, who will shortly introduce themselves. These aren't predictions of how things will definitely turn out. Far from it. They're predictions of how things might turn out and things that we need to consider. These predictions deserve attention so we can make better informed decisions here and now about actions required. By thinking carefully about potential scenarios, we may become aware that some are particularly bad. And once we see the unintended bad consequences of these scenarios, we may fight much harder to try to avoid them. Conversely, we may come to appreciate that some other scenarios aren't as bad as first appears. These scenarios may appear strange because they challenge what has previously been central assumptions of society. But once we set aside our future shock, once we step aside from the inertia of inherited thinking, we may collectively decide that they're good outcomes in the circumstance, and we may take powerful actions to try to increase the chances of these scenarios happening. But which scenarios deserve our attention? How can we divide up the large space of possibilities? That's where our panelists today will be helping us, as well as everybody else watching online, and whose comments we will appreciate in chat and in the questions and answers. Before we hear in more detail from the panelists, I'll ask them now each to briefly introduce themselves, their names, where they're coming from, and any organizations they represent. Simon.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, David. My name's Simon Mair. I'm an ecological economist. Most of my work is on what we call the political economy of sustainability. So this is essentially trying to understand the relationship between our current economy and the environment and society, and thinking about whether we might change that relationship to achieve better, more socially just and environmentally sound outcomes. I do research at the University of Surrey in the UK on a project called the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. And I also teach at Salford University, which is also in the UK.
So where are you connecting from today?
I'm currently connecting from Doncaster, and I am sat in a caravan outside of my in-laws' house.
Thanks for joining us. Mair.
Right. Hi, everyone. So I'm Mair Palmer, and I've been asked to brand myself today. So I'm a journalist with Sifted, which is a sort of a spin out from the Financial Times, focusing on European technology and startups. And so we're looking very much about. We've always been looking at the kind of the new economy. So I particularly write about things like drones and flying taxis and AI, and those are all things which I think, it's interesting. There's a lot of predictions about whether those will become vastly accelerated, or at least some of them, as a result of this crisis. But we won't go into that. But just to say that Sifted is sort of constantly looking at some of these, and so I'm interested as much as any of the panelists to get a sense of which direction we might be going.
Thanks. Bronwyn.
I'm Bronwyn Williams. I'm with a company called Flux Trends. We do corporate foresight and trend analysis. And my background is in both foresight futures and in economics. So I do have a bit of a econs take on things, which is probably a little bit different to the rest of the members on the panel.
And where are you connecting from, Bronwyn?
I'm connecting from Johannesburg in South Africa, on the other side of the world from the rest of the panelists here today.
So thanks to everybody for these introductions. Before we go further, let me just point out to people, if you haven't seen it, there is a box at the bottom called Ask a Question. And what you're able to do there from time to time is take a look at the questions that some of your fellow audience members have put in. And if you like a question and wish the panelists to pay attention to it, you can vote it up. Generally, keeping your questions brief is good. People's eyes will glaze over if there are too many paragraphs in there. So that's one thing you can do. There is a poll, which again, you can find near the bottom of your screen, which various people have been answering already. I think we've got a mix of different answers. The biggest answer in the poll so far, to which is the most likely description for society in 5 to 10 years' time, is something entirely different from any of the above scenarios. So we may hear some different scenarios later on. And in second place is, with 13 votes, which is 27% of those who have voted, that there'll be a flourishing of local mutual aid communities. And third, with 23% of the votes, is not much will have changed. We'll be back to business as usual, more or less. So these are some things you can cast your eye over a little bit when you are not entirely listening to whatever the panelists are saying at any particular moment. But before we go into the questions, let's hear in more length the suggestions from the panelists. And let's start with Simon.
Well, so David very kindly sent round a piece I wrote for the conversation as kind of a suggested pre-reading. So I'm going to draw a lot from what I wrote in there, really. So for me, there are two key elements, or two key factors I think are important in thinking about post-COVID futures. And the first of those is value. And by value, I essentially mean, like, what is the guiding principle of the economy? What is the economy for? And the second is the level of organization. So does society organize its productive capacity kind of centrally through something like the state? Or does it do it in a very distributed way, which could be either markets, so lots of kind of businesses, or it could be through kind of non-market, community-oriented organizations. To give you a little background on kind of how I got to those two key elements, I want to tell you a bit more, for those of you who don't know, essentially about my background. So I said I'm an ecological economist, and in my work I draw on a variety of schools of economic thought. So I work with feminist economics, post-Keynesian economics, a bit of kind of political Marxist thinking, and also I've done quite a bit of work on Adam Smith's framework, so that kind of classical economic theory. The point of this is to say that essentially where this brings me into kind of my overall framework of how I think about the economy, which is not, as I think we often talk about it, so not just as a kind of a market where we buy and sell consumer goods, but essentially as a system of provisioning. So the system by which we decide at a societal level how we take resources from the environment, and then what we do with those. So what goods will we produce and how we distribute those goods. When you think about the economy in this way, I think what you kind of come to see is that there are lots of different ways you could organize that system of provisioning. And essentially within any kind of economic ideology or economic system, there are lots of different systems which coexist, but they are kind of in a different level of balance or a different level of tension with one another. So for me, capitalism is essentially a system of market dependency. It's one in which the majority of people are dependent on the market to obtain the basic goods that they need to survive. So food, shelter would be kind of the key examples. And I do think this is kind of important. It's instructive in looking at how we've responded to COVID so far, particularly in kind of countries like the UK, the US, Western Europe, because essentially these are highly market-oriented economies. And this brings challenges because markets essentially have very specific dynamics. They tend to focus on one type of value. And in a Marxian tradition, you would call this exchange value, but a lot of ecological economists prefer to call it just monetary value. So it's that value that you can capture in any kind of monetary metrics. So, you know, a dollar, a pound, a yen, whatever. This is kind of one of the interesting things about this is that essentially, when it comes to monetary value, exchange value, it requires you to compress all the different ways that we value things in our world into one form. And what I think we're seeing with the kind of COVID situation is that actually there are some things which it is very, very hard to compress into that one form of value. So in particular, when we think about all the reasons that we value a human life, I think I would say, I don't think it's so controversial to say, but we can't capture all the different reasons that we value a human life in one single metric, be that financial or otherwise. And yet, in a lot of economies, this one single metric, this monetary metric, is the key driver of how we organize most of our productive capacity. And so this is why, or what this is for me, one of the big stumbling blocks, has been one of the big stumbling blocks to a kind of fast and effective response to the coronavirus crisis. It's also important in thinking about where we go in the future, because I think a lot of responses we've seen to the COVID-19 pandemic have been outside the market. They've operated by prioritizing different kinds of value. So we see this both from the state in terms of how they've pushed more resources and upscaled production in kind of national health systems, but also in kind of more community-oriented, non-market ways of producing. So I'm thinking particularly here about those kind of mutual aid groups which have kind of been set up to help deliver groceries and other essential goods to people who are isolating and can't get out. The people working in these systems, I would say, are doing essential economic work, but they aren't in a market. They aren't being paid for it, and they're not expecting payment for it. It's fundamentally a non-market kind of activity. So for me, the question then is, going forward, do we think that one of those two, the kind of relationship between those two forms of value and value, the different ways of valuing activity, will shift? Currently, I would say, particularly in the UK, Western Europe, North America, it's very much around monetary value and markets. But there's a possibility here that actually with the rise of kind of more state-led control, but also more empowered community groups, we start to see a kind of different kind of value emerging as a priority here. And I think if that shift happens, you will see a very different structure of an economy than we have today, much less market-oriented, with a lot of different kinds of activity going on. So my second key element then is very much related to that as well, which is this idea of organization. Organization is important, I think, in thinking about the future of the economy, because so we know that markets are highly distributed in terms of being a system of provisioning. So there's lots of small units making decisions. But under neoliberal capitalism, kind of the brand of capitalism which has been dominant for the last kind of 40 years, actually what we've seen is this kind of odd and kind of interesting relationship between the state and the market. So the state, which is a very centralized entity, plays a fundamental role in creating markets and protecting markets under neoliberalism. So I think what we have is this very kind of interesting and nuanced relationship where we have an economic system which is at the same time both highly distributed and also highly centralized. And what I think is interesting then is thinking about how that relationship evolves going forward. Do we see, when we think about the state kind of expanding its power, if that happens, does that have to happen in a kind of authoritarian sense, or could it continue to be kind of distributed? And also, when we think about distributed power and distributed economic activity, can we imagine it in ways which are very different than the kind of market orientation that we have now? Can we see a kind of flourishing of those mutual aid groups, as the scenario David mentioned suggested? And again, I think this is important thinking about the future, because whether you go for a highly distributed or highly centralized economy, and where you fall on that kind of balance, is really going to affect how your society looks overall.
So it is interesting that many people are saying they've learnt from the COVID crisis that many of the most important jobs are the lowly paid jobs. They are the cleaners, they are the nurses, they are the transport workers, that without them the society will not function, but they aren't the people to whom we pay the most money. As you said, there's a recognition that a lot of the most important work is not paid at all, and people wouldn't expect it to be paid. So you're suggesting there's a possibility that the influence of the money-based economy, the exchange, may decline, and that gradually we'll have a new kind of interaction economy coexisting with financial economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely possible, but I mean, I do think one of the kind of, I mean, partly what you talked about at the start, David, with this kind of idea of uncertainty, I guess what I'm suggesting is that the COVID pandemic has upset the dominant economic ideology and showed that it is not objective, but is something which is constructed. And in that way, it kind of opens up this new economic space. The question of where we go with that depends whose ideas move into that space and how the system evolves. It's not by any means certain that we'll move towards a different kind of economy. It's
similar to how the stagflation of the 1970s and led to a collapse in the consensus around Keynesianism and neo-Keynesianism, which said, well, you've always got high unemployment or you've got high inflation, you don't have both. And it seemed that there was a situation in which it invalidated these central assumptions of society, and it led to the adoption of the neoliberalist ideas at that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
At this stage, thanks so much for these opening remarks. I'd like to bring in Mair Palmer, who has a background, as you've heard, working with the FT and now works with Sifted. What's your perspectives on this, Mair?
Well, there's a kind of, I mean, one of the things I wanted to pick up on from Simon's sort of axes that he set out, and was this kind of state versus grassroots action, and one of the things that I found really interesting to watch as this kind of crisis has unfolded is the very strong grassroots efforts that have sprung up everywhere, especially, I mean, most notably in the beginning with the sort of the shortage of ventilators and breathing aids, and we've seen kind of local maker groups in Spain coalescing and very quickly being able to come together to create machines that are perfectly workable, and I just wonder where this experience will leave us, because in normal circumstances, of course, these machines would be never let anywhere near a hospital. It would take years for them to get any kind of approval, but so in Spain particularly, they didn't even go down that route. I mean, they basically were just talking directly to doctors in local hospitals who were desperate. And said, you know what, just make it and we'll worry about it later. And of course, it wasn't a complete free-for-all, but they did the very most basic sort of tests. So they tested them on, I think, pigs. And once the pigs survived that ordeal, the hospital ethics committee met and said, can we approve these for use as a last resort? And that was it. That was enough for them to be, put into use. And in some ways, I mean, it's terrible, although it's really terrible that we've been brought to that, it was a sort of huge moment of empowerment for people that I think only when that happened did we realize how much we'd almost been sort of missing that kind of permission to do things and have agency in a lot of these decisions. And And so I think if there's one thing that comes out for me is this sort of, in the beginning, as the COVID crisis was unfolding, and it didn't feel very real to us in Europe for about a month, or even 2 months before it really hit. And it was almost like everyone was waiting for someone else to do something. We were waiting for permission to do something. What were the people in charge going to do? And then there was this huge shift where it was like, whatever the official response is, it's become quite clear that it's going to be too slow, it's probably going to be misinformed, and it's just simply not going to be effective and reach the places quick enough. So people then really took matters into their own hands. And I think the really interesting question is, yes, so after this is all over, how does that kind of change the way in which we sort of interact between individuals and then sort of organizations or institutions, whether they be governmental or big businesses? Because it again, and we see it over and over again in all the different spheres, when as soon as the UK government put out a call for people to volunteer to help the NHS, so to deliver medicines to people who were sheltering at home and so on, they had many times more the number of volunteers than they'd originally asked for when they've asked for people to help with the harvest and picking fruit. Again, we've had more people step forward. So everyone is, there's this kind of tremendous willingness for people to do things. But what's been entirely lacking is kind of mechanisms to allow them to do that. And that, if there's one thing that I would just love to see coming out of this, is a better way to kind of empower people, to empower communities. And that's why I sort of feel quite attracted to Simon's sort of that box on the matrix, which is the mutual aid, self-sufficiency type thing. And I mean, partly that's an emotional response, because I would love for that to be the case. But I also think, in terms of, if we look at the sort of early things of what we're seeing, that it feels like there's an appetite for people certainly to do that. The big question is, how can it be harnessed? And as a kind of final thought, for one thing that we can look at to sort of maybe see how we could, this might be able to evolve, is when we look at one thing that I've been looking at a little bit in the past week or so is sort of the efforts to now start looking for treatments and vaccines, and the intellectual property specifically around that. So IP is just not something that anybody really thinks of in the heat of the crisis, because of, and that's been the first thing to sort of go. I mean, if you look at those volunteers in Italy 3D printing valves, when they couldn't get replacements from the actual company. It turns out, actually, just to be clear, the company never threatened to sue them, but it's certainly true that the company didn't help them particularly in getting the blueprints for this, so they did have to reverse engineer the part themselves. But IP has kind of been shoved aside, I think, for the last couple of weeks. But when we start to think about the more long haul of this, so the long search for treatments, effective treatments, and then the even longer haul search for the vaccine, there's going to be, and there are just multiple different ways that people are talking about pooling patents. That's one option, and you're looking at, but there's also kind of various people stepping forward to give some sort of very rapid licensing frameworks, so that you can allow people to use your technology, and you're not charging royalties for it. It's all completely free, but you're giving at least some kind of legal framework, so that it's done in a more organized way. And so I'm really interested in watching those efforts to see if they can give us some clues about ways to kind of harness kind of grassroots activity much more effectively, but still in an organized way, so that it doesn't go in every direction and end up being really ineffective because of a lack of organization. So
some of this reminds me of what the former British Prime Minister David Cameron used to talk about, with his vision of a big society, that things would be organized, there would be more volunteers, there would be more people doing things without waiting for central permission. But do you think this is a permanent shift, or do you think that after the crisis is gone, we'll be reverting to our old days and IP lawyers will be chasing us again? Or is there a need to somehow change some of the systems to keep this big society spirit alive longer?
Well, I think it kind of depends on whether we then end up being in a more protracted emergency situation afterwards because of the economic situation. Because there again, I can see that people would then try to, if there's kind of widespread economic failure, then people will be forced to do things on a more local level to keep things going where they can. And if we do that for a long time, then I think it will leave a sort of habit of self-help in that way. But I think it would be, but even imagine that we snap back and we have this V-shaped, recovery curve that some people are still hoping for. I'm not sure if I'm convinced that it's going to be that quick, but let's imagine it was. I think even then, I think we will have learned some things about just how, I don't know, like I just do think some of those structures maybe will remain with us. So it would be easier for somebody to say, okay, go ahead, develop this and do it. And then, there is this kind of fairly easy web-based mechanism for which you can now kind of make sure that you're licensed, and that, that stuff becomes much less cumbersome. You no longer having to wait for sort of 5 years to get approval from the medical council for something. So
many thanks, Mair. I'm sure we'll come back to the question shortly of whether we are going to be in a V-shape return, or whether it's going to be an L shape, or as some people have said, an I shape, which is straight down. And I think our future depends a lot on what of these scenarios will come about. But let's hear now from Bronwyn Williams. You, I'm sure, got a slightly different perspective on this. What would you like to say?
Yeah, well, I suppose I do have a slightly different vantage point. I obviously live in a slightly different society to what's going on in the UK at the moment, so I can speak from my perspective, but I think I do have a fairly good idea of what's going on in the global sort of context too. And for me, the key axis of uncertainty for me is very much what's going to materialize at the end of this in terms of the balance of structural power from individual freedom to centralized control. So whether that's centralized control being centralized with governments and states, or whether it's being centralized towards big companies, I think that's something we're really going to have found has shifted, because it's only been a couple of weeks and we suddenly be talking about cell phone companies being able to track consumers, and they share that information with the governments, and it's just done by decree. So it's been a short-term, basically rule by law instead of rule of law that we've had to become accustomed to very quickly, very much getting used to a lot of our freedoms being taken away. And I think for me, the challenge comes is, what is the exit strategy for that? Is there an exit strategy, or has the line permanently shifted away from a lot of the, I don't really want to say it, but I suppose Western liberal values that we are accustomed to? And I suppose the other uncertainty for me is not to do with structural and systemic control, but rather towards with societal attitudes. And that is the attitudes either being more individualistic or towards being more collectivist, or having a broader globalist view as to what's going on in the world in general. And that's not something necessarily coming top down from states, but rather it's an attitudinal shift, as the previous speaker was talking about, this concept of thinking beyond the individual and thinking beyond the me towards sort of more of consciousness. And that also, it's uncertain for me, because from my vantage point in South Africa, one of the earliest signs to come out of the current crisis was an increase in xenophobia and xenophobia, which is exactly the opposite of what I know the previous speakers were talking about, this whole sort of collective consciousness that's developing. And I've seen rather more sort of siloing of the different segments of society. It's also been rather interesting and also a little bit disturbing for me to observe the shifts towards different segments of the economic society really not banding together, but perhaps actually working against each other, because we are definitely seeing a massive split. This is not an equalizing crisis, it's very much highlighting the rifts in our societies. I live in a very unequal society, the most unequal society in the world, according to Gini coefficients. And what we're really seeing is that divide between the really rich and the really poor is just being completely widened by this. The most vulnerable people are the most vulnerable in terms of health and also in terms of economics. And it's yet settled for me to see whether we're going to end up with a greater sense of solidarity as humans by the end of this, or with a more selfish, individualistic, at least I'm okay and I can actually capitalize on this and I can actually make a lot of money out of this crisis, because crisis capitalism really is a thing, and there's a lot of money to be made in crises because there are more problems, and more problems are more things that you can solve. But that basically summarizes things I'm thinking about: the shift in power dynamics from liberal values to more authoritarian, more control is going to be left behind. And on the other hand, the value shift as to whether we're going to end up with a more isolated, more insular society by the end of this, or a more collective, more kind community that we get out of it. And I think those two questions are very much up in the air and will not be determined in the next few months, but rather in the next few years, as we see what we're able to backtrack in terms of the changes in values and rights, and as things go forward.
Well, I think you're entirely right to draw our attention not just to the greater collective consciousness, but to the greater divisiveness which seems to be happening in some parts in parallel. There have sadly been a number of racist attacks. People who are perceived to be Chinese were in some cases victimized at the start. It's not clear how much that extended. The United States of America are proving not to be very united just now. Many of the states are competing with each other to get a hold of medical equipment. Instead of a collaborative process, there is more of a tribal, divisive process. And your remarks also remind me of something that we were discussing in the green room a few minutes ago, which Mair was raising, which was the topic of Emily Maitlis, the BBC Two reporter, who was talking about this crisis is not affecting all of us equally. It's affecting the poor people more, because we don't have the luxuries of when we're poor of having a nice isolation. We are much more living next to each other. So there are many disturbing trends as well as positive trends, and we're going to have to identify them. Yeah. Thanks for these opening remarks. Do any of you want another minute to embellish what you've said already, or to react to what you've heard from the others?
I wondered if I could just come back to Bronwyn, actually, on what you were saying about the sort of divisiveness, because I'm also really interested in kind of looking at how, this is such a great experiment in how a society, how societies behave under stress. And one thing, in the UK, for example, there is this great collectivism in one sense that has a positive side where people are sort of, doing shopping for their neighbours and that kind of thing. But there's also a kind of fairly nasty side of it as well. So I was listening to a radio phone-in program the other day where people were basically calling in to complain about sort of, neighbours and people who they felt were doing things that were sort of not essential during the crisis. So someone rang in to say that, they had seen their neighbour take a delivery of some cupcakes from a bakery, and that they thought this was outrageous. How dare they be sort of eating cupcakes when we're in a serious crisis? And I've also, I've just heard this from various kind of friends, a friend went to do her sort of weekly allocated shop, as we are allowed to go shopping for food. And while she was in the supermarket, she bought some things also for her daughter's birthday. So not only food items. And she had people sort of tutting at her basket going, are you sure that's necessary? Why are you buying, party hats when it's, and it feels like that this sort of social monitoring. So even when we are, even if we do pull together as a society, which it sounds like maybe in South Africa, it's not even pulling together as a society. When we pull together, it has this kind of slightly big brotherish edge that makes me very nervous.
Yeah, just to pick up back on that. So just not to pick on South Africa too much, there definitely are things or movements of solidarity, but there are also those other undercurrents. So I don't want to say it's one or the other. That's why for me it's an uncertainty. It's not a defined trend yet, as much as we've seen xenophobic issues coming on board. We've also seen some people stepping up and some corporates being very kind and letting people have holidays on their loan payments, etc. they didn't have to do. So there's a bit of that community there. But I think the bigger point is what you just mentioned there, this whole thing of surveillance, which kind of fits on both of those uncertainties I was talking about, because you can have decentralized surveillance too, where it basically becomes a global sort of neighborhood watch where all neighbors are spying on each other and tattling on each other to the police, etc. Or it can be the very much more dystopian sort sort of surveillance, which I think that we are generally being asked to get used to right now, because those are really the choices that are being laid out for us in the shorter term to say, if we want to get out of lockdowns, we're going to have to submit to some sort of more organized or centralized form of surveillance, something more that's what's happened per se in the Asian countries, where they've had these sort of monitoring networks in place for quite a long time. And for me, it's quite interesting to see how quickly the conversation has become okay with that, whereas 3 months ago, when I was doing keynotes about different trends emerging from the East and from the West, etc., people were horrified at the concept of their state going to be able to surveil them through their cell phone, monitor their contacts, their location, all the rest of it. So I find it quite interesting to see how quickly the goalposts have moved in that direction.
Yeah, and I wonder whether we in fact end up with kind of both, actually. Like I think that, you know, we may end up with both the sort of the top-down surveillance, so you're having to submit your phone records, which actually, weirdly enough, that bothers me less than the thought of living in this kind of slightly Eastern, you know, East Germany sort of existence, where you're also aware that you're being watched by your neighbors, and if you go out for more than one walk a day, somebody, you know, from across the road will be watching behind their net curtains and call the police on you. I mean, I think that, to be honest, that sort of vision is almost more disturbing to me, because I feel like then it really pulls apart your sort of ability to trust your neighbors and friends. So that's
very social cohesion, right? I mean, how can you have a cohesive collective kindness if everyone distrusts everyone else? And I think that's actually what happened.
Yeah,
that's actually what happened. Sorry.
Simon?
You're jumping in.
In a way, want to kind of push back a little bit on this idea that neighbours policing what they feel to be kind of a commonly agreed acceptable behaviour is somehow kind of a breach of trust or works against some kind of social solidarity. Like it clearly depends on like what behaviours are kind of being reported and who they're being reported to, but the idea of some kind of community level policing of commonly agreed behaviours doesn't inherently seem worrying to me. It seems like the foundations for social solidarity.
It depends if we can agree on what the agreed behaviors are, because I think, you know, absolutely, I've got no problem with the idea that people should follow the sort of government guidance, social distancing, only exercising once a day, trying to minimize, food shopping, all the rest of it. But I think it's like I certainly feel like there's a sort of tendency to push that even further. So this is the point at which people, and I think, it's the case when you've looked at very authoritarian states where people have done that kind of snitching, is what happens is people then use it to settle grudges, and people who are sort of a bit put out and grumpy will kind of, and so I think there's also this sort of gray area of, well, what are we allowed to do? You're allowed to go out for essentials, and but then people's definitions of what those essentials are very different, right? So food is fine, but if you buy a cake, is that not fine? It's not essential to have a cake. If I buy a loaf of bread, you're not going to argue with me, but do we all have to exist now on a diet of stew and bread and dripping to sort of be socially acceptable? Or are we allowed to have the occasional cupcake without fear of somebody sort of frowning at us? That's the sort of beginnings of the disturbingness that I wouldn't like to see that kind of increase.
Thanks to the people in chat who are adding the comments on this. The question is whether we're just noticing things that are already normally present and we're just noticing them more, or whether there really are trends. So Stuart Chirova says South Africa was already experiencing xenophobic attacks long before the COVID-19 crisis. He says there is no correlation yet between COVID-19 and xenophobia. We're going to move shortly to the questions. My comment on the surveillance is I think this is a topic where technology of surveillance is going to get a whole lot more attention. Not just the cameras, but how the data management works. There are algorithms which are claimed to do a lot of useful data surveillance while still preserving privacy. There are things called federated learning and decentralized data gathering, and they may sound like magic, but it seems that in some sense they are real possibilities. People talk about zero knowledge proofs. I think that just as we're going to see a whole greater interest in the technology of vaccines and the technology of antiviral medicines, we're going to see a much greater interest in how we can have the positive aspects of surveillance without having the negative aspects of surveillance. And it's not just a matter of ethics, it's a matter of technology. Now, I'm going to give people a moment. Let's pause the discussion. Let people click on that Ask a Question button, and you will have a chance to vote for which questions you think the panel should be addressing. We have, 117 people live, a great amount of brains and wisdom there. So let's take the questions from the top of the list. So whilst people are reviewing that, let me pose to the panel this first question. Do we think which businesses will thrive? Which new economic trends are we expecting? Where will the stock market go? Will it be great for some areas and poor for others? Because after all, without a thriving economy, society is going to change significantly. Who would like to start answering that?
I can give a broad strokes. In terms of which businesses are going to thrive, I think it depends very much where aid money ends up going. I think that most industries are definitely impacted by this. Some are easier to survive. Some are basically business as usual. If you're in a virtual-based business, if you run a digital ad agency, for example, it's business as usual. So you won't necessarily be a winner out of it, but you're definitely not going to suddenly find yourself without any sort of income. There's another huge chunk of the economy, whether you're a gym owner or a pub owner or a restaurant, etc., that unless there is aid money forthcoming, those businesses will pretty much be decimated within that sector of the economy. But then it comes down to where all governments, basically every government that has been impacted by this, is putting large aid packages together, whether it's through quantitative easing type programs or whether it's through direct aid, like we've got an SME fund that's being set up. It depends very much which sector of the economy that bonus money, that helicopter money is going to land on. So it depends on the country. And I've definitely seen different values in the different countries I've looked at as to where that saving cash is going to go for those businesses that are literally having to pause their income for the duration of any sort of lockdown.
In a way, I suppose I'm less optimistic about those kind of immediate short-term trends, because I'm not sure that simply kind of a kind of standard Keynesian set of policies of kind of even fairly extreme ones of directly financing certain businesses will be sufficient to see economic activity really recover. Because if, as you said, you've got huge sectors of your economy that are shut down, they are not going to be, even if they get some kind of direct financial support from the government, I don't see them going out and buying the services of the advertising sector, because why would they? What's the purpose of them doing that if they can't operate? So I really do wonder, and I don't entirely know, but I really do wonder if we'll see some more kind of radical steps taken to try and kickstart that kind of market economy again.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't really comment on the greater sort of help packages, but just in terms of what we've been looking at Sifted, in terms of if you take startups as a kind of petri dish of what survives and thrives, just because these companies are working on often such small margins and they very quickly lose their funding when they don't look viable. But I mean, so at the moment, certainly all the kind of virtual conferencing stuff, anything that can be delivered via the internet is doing pretty well. I mean, a lot of where you have seen some of the large corporations still investing, it's in things to do with delivery, online shopping, delivery infrastructure, software to do with orchestrating all of that. So basically every company at the moment, if they can, if they sell physical goods, is trying to turn itself into Amazon. So anybody who works around that area and offers something for that is seeing a lot of money come in. Esports. If I was going to invest in something right now, that I'd probably pick esports as being the most recession and COVID-proof business going, because there's no football, there's no live sports being played at all. So we're seeing huge increases in audiences, and for a lot of these guys, sorry, I'm going to be really flippant, but they're sort of self-isolating is probably not that much of a difference in their habits, right? So they live most of their life, in their online communities anyway. But that's a flippant remark about a serious situation, so I apologize for that. But I mean, we're basically seeing a difference in, there are definitely, there have been startups that have been able to do financing rounds, right now in the middle of the crisis, where you would think that all the markets would be slammed shut, but certain, and some of these companies, and again, anything to do with digital health, to some extent ed tech, although I think that trend will happen maybe a little later, because we're still in kind of trying to work out all of this. But anyway, so they're getting money, they're getting funded, and they're getting more users, and we'll see how long that will be sustained. Of course, if fundamental economic systems are disrupted, then yes, they too will struggle for money. But I'm just talking about what's happening in the next 6 months to a year. A lot of those companies are, they're still hiring people. We have a long list unsifted of companies that are still actively today looking for people to join their teams, because they want to go faster, they want to develop. Definitely, if you're a developer with transferable skills right now, you're not going to be unemployed for very long.
So there might be some surge in interest in esports and companies providing esports. There might be some surge in interest in companies providing ed tech or digital health. What about the companies that are helping people to automate more? Because there's been for a long time a question, well, I might automate this process, but I'd prefer to keep my human employees engaged. Now, when there's a risk that human employees can't come back into the business anytime soon, there might be a rush to say, right, let's hurry up and do this automation. So Zoom, I'm told, is having a surge in interest. Is this good news in a sense in the midst of a crisis for some of the companies that can turn the vision and the promise of AI and automation and robotics into something real?
Well, I think it's a good time to be trying to solve a problem if you are a startup, if you have access to capital and skills, but it's not for everyone at all. And I don't think a lot of businesses are looking to invest in new technologies right now. It wouldn't make much sense in the current climate. You have to see where things are going first. Everything is up in the air. There are no rules. But I think one of the bigger trends to emerge out of this is definitely going to be that we're seeing vicious and virtuous circles appearing. We're seeing the rich getting richer. We're seeing companies that can survive doing very, very well in those industries. If you identify things like your esports and some of your developer companies and all the rest of it, really winning a lot. And on the other hand, you've got the sort of businesses that are losing, that sort of missing middle chunk of the economy. They're not quite essential services, but they also just can't translate directly online. And generally, they do tend to be your SME-sized organizations there. They're just losing and losing again. They're losing because of lockdowns. They're also losing because of lack of access to finance. They're losing for a whole lot of reasons, particularly in my country. I know that I think it's very similar in the UK, where your SMEs tend to have like less than a month's worth of cash runway, which means that that segment of the economy just can't bounce back afterwards. So I think what we're seeing is a big divide, a large gap between the people that can win and win a lot and those that can't. And I think that's probably the biggest threat to come out of this from the economic side, and that's that acceleration and deepening of very deep inequality between the different sides of the market. And that's not the positive side of the story at all, but that's the reality.
Do we expect that more parts of industry will need to depend on the government and public funds? It's said that in Britain, many of the railways will have to be nationalised again. It's even talked about the airlines not being commercially viable as independent companies, and they'll need to be run by the government. The former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling, who was at the midst of the 2008 crisis, is on record as saying that he thinks the government needs to move from just being the lender of last resort to being the supplier of last resort too. This would be a bigger transformation how the economy works, recognizing that some services still need to be put in place, but we can't rely on the profit mechanisms and the free market to sustain them. Any of you have views on that possibility?
For me, that's actually the fundamental of that is it's a normative question rather than a purely descriptive one. Because I think, as Bronwyn was just saying, you may well see some market actors doing very well out of this. And it's interesting to think about when you say companies becoming dependent on the state and think about what that means. Because obviously, until very recently, when the tests themselves seem to have failed, the UK government was talking about delivering widespread kind of COVID-19 testing through the market, through Amazon and through Boots. So that's not a direct, it's not a dependency in where you're talking about nationalising the railways or nationalising the airlines, but it is certainly a very close relationship between a large private sector actor and the state. So for me, this, like I said, this question is very normative, because the question is not so much will companies have to become dependent on the state, but is that something that we want? Do we want to do, as you say, and protect certain sectors of the economy from the kind of whims of a market, or do we want to kind of let it go and trust to a kind of innovating, creative destruction?
So we're coming on now to questions of what we want, or questions of cultural, questions of norms. So I'm going to move on to the next question on the list. That first question, by the way, was by Vartik Nicoletta. So thanks for that. Let's move to a question which has been placed by Marguerite Coetzee on culture. If culture is considered to be shared beliefs, values, and experiences, what culture or cultural impacts do we see emerging from this turbulent time? And you've already had some analysis of this, but maybe there's more you can say now on that question.
This is, I think, a really important, really interesting question, because partly because I think this kind of, whether we see a cultural shift, and speaks to kind of Bronwyn's ideas about this kind of collective versus collectivism versus individualism. I think that will emerge, could potentially emerge out of these kind of new behaviours we're seeing in terms of like the volunteering and the mutual aid. But whether this kind of new way of participating in the economy, this new way of participating in society for a lot of people becomes a cultural shift, for me depends on whether those people become kind of politicized through it. So whether they see it as something they are doing because we're in a crisis and this is the kind of thing you do in a crisis, or whether they do it and they come to think, okay, so is this a better way of doing things than we do normally? Is there something I want to keep from this? And is that something I can take into a political arena? I have no idea whether that kind of politicization will happen, although for me personally, I do kind of hope it does, because I think to support that cultural change, to support that kind of what Marja was talking about with the kind of how do you support people doing these innovative things, what you need to build is material structures in society that support people to do those things. There's no sense in which we will move away from a kind of very profit-oriented economy where people are viciously protective over their IP if actually you are entirely dependent on a market and being able to sell your intellectual property in order to, pay your bills and pay your mortgage.
Anybody else got views on that?
Not really.
Yeah, I'm just interested, Simon. Like, so how? I mean, this isn't really an answer from me, but more like a sort of an additional question. But so if we have this big outpouring and people now do organize themselves, so if you look at something like the network of makers in Spain, 2,000 plus people now who have kind of really organized themselves, and I'm incredibly impressed with how quickly they've sort of created their own structure out of chaos. I mean, they have, I think, 34 regional leaders, and they organize everything in there, and then they have, meeting. Anyway, it's come together quite quickly. But in a way that kind of allows them to operate in a coherent way. How do you feel we can take that forward once we come out of the crisis situation? I mean, what needs to happen to allow that, rather than everyone just disbands and goes back to whatever else they did on Saturdays before that, or their evenings?
Sure. I mean, well, for me, it's about, I guess, giving people the space and the means to expand that from a Saturday evening activity into more of a kind of core working week activity. And I think the way you do that is you free people from having to kind of work in the market to provide for themselves. You move to a more kind of democratically organized economy. So my general kind of feeling, my general analysis is that huge portions of the population in Western Europe and in North America tend to work doing things that they don't think are particularly useful, that they don't particularly enjoy, and they do it because that's how they make money to buy food and pay bills, essentially. So I think if you take those things out of the market provision, you make housing a right, you make food a right that you have access to in some other way, then you free people up to say, okay, so what is it that I can contribute to society, and how do I go about doing that?
And to some extent, I feel like the seeds of that have already been there for some time, because, again, at Sifted, we've been writing for a long time about the phenomenon of millennials and what they look for in jobs. And in the sort of happy times of full employment, when companies had to compete for work, there was quite a lot about having to prove that your business had some kind of higher purpose than simply being paid. Now, what's interesting is people still wanted the paycheck, right? So they were, because, as you say, you need it. You still need to pay your council tax. You still need to pay, your rent. But to some extent, I think that culture of searching for purpose was already there. And so I'm wondering if we are in some ways, this is pushing at an open door, and that a lot of people want that anyway. But then the question is, like, how do it is still quite a wrench to go from that, because even these companies that would have a purpose were still operating basically in a sort of profit loss framework. Even the ones who were very if you take a company like for example Karma, which is a Swedish startup that tried to eliminate food waste, and so they have this great purpose. They're able to attract lots of people to work for them because, they really believe in this, but it was always clear, this has to be a profitable company because, otherwise they didn't feel that it could sustain itself. And they didn't want to kind of exist for 6 months with some drought money and then run, get systems going and then run out of steam. So I just think that the transition is a really huge one. So the culture, the will is there, but the actual mechanism of doing it is really unclear to me.
Yeah, how you actually organize that is very interesting, but it's how the incentives and the structures are set up. So it's quite an interesting project that is currently paused, but it was set up in South Africa that I want to just put forward there. And it kind of merged a lot of the concepts of this collective sort of mutual economy with some of those ideas of solidarity. It was a project called Project UBU, or Project UBU, and what they did was they set up as basically a universal basic income, which is one of those handy ideas that have been lying around in the midst of this crisis, as we've seen, what's going on in places like the US and Spain. But what they did is it was based on a cryptocurrency platform rather than being centrally distributed through a state. So it wasn't tax funded. It was funded rather by this community-based currency that everyone that signed up to the app, and they were very much from very poor areas, got access to their free basic token of this particular virtual currency every single day, but they were able to exchange that currency for real world goods. And that was quite an interesting concept, because it was linking like a community-based currency and economy with a real world economy. So I think those are sort of ideas that have space to develop when the world is in pause, but there's not an easy switch from a market-based economy into suddenly a collectivist economy without falling back into the traps of centralization once again, which we know from global history just doesn't work that well. So there needs to be a way that these systems can be self-sustaining and not top-down enforced if we want to build a mutual-based new form of economy, new form of society going forward. So I'm really interested in those sort of concepts, these new radical market kind of concepts, these incentive-based ways of structuring systems that aren't based on the current systems that we have right now, that can actually be self-sustaining. So I think that's really the challenge, is how do you make these things sustainable and perpetuate without having to impose a structure on them that actually ends up perpetuating more unintended consequences and lag effects down the line. But I think there are concepts out there. I think that's the encouraging thing, and now's the time to talk about them, because this is when ideas take root.
I'm going to add another question into the discussion in a minute. I'll just to summarize some of the points I heard in that sometimes we'll get a cultural change because of a groundswell of desire from people. Sometimes the cultural change needs to be assisted by changes in incentives. For example, when governments made it easier for people to have their pensions topped up by companies, and when the default was that you were making a contribution to the pension, that change of incentive helped more long-term thinking. Another possible change of incentive has been mentioned as if there was something like a universal basic income, people would be less at the mercy of having to get a job with whichever employer was available, and they might have more freedom to do some of the other things. But finally, I'd like to mention, as a technologist here, that technology may have a role in enabling new culture as well. One reason we had more collaboration was because of various technologies, such as open source software, such as 3D printing, such as the growing possibilities for decentralized AI, possibly decentralized autonomous organizations, and as you just mentioned, Bronwyn, the possibilities for new currencies. So it is possible that there may be more focus on the technologies that would accelerate a cultural change that people would like to see, but which wouldn't happen otherwise. I've now discovered that the Crowdcast doesn't sort the questions in order of most votes, and that the most interesting questions are further down the list. So now that I've discovered that, I'm going to come to a question by Rohit Talwar, which I believe is the most voted currently, which is one about the distribution of power between the governments in the world. I'll read it out. Do the panel think we will see any significant shifts taking place around the world in the distribution of power between governments, the owners of capital, and wider society? And how might these shifts come about?
Well, yes, there will be shifts. Depending on where those shifts end up is a bit more of an open-ended question. But I can speak from an African perspective at the moment, and very much, I'm sure most of you know, South Africa, where I live, we've just been junk status downgraded and all the rest of it. And it looks like there's a possibility we might have to be bailed out by perhaps the IMF, or what is increasingly becoming a political agenda here. The politicians are looking more to get bailed out by BRICS partners, which is once again a shift in where people are looking for value and for support. I think that one of the sadder consequences of the current crisis will be that African economies that were doing a little bit better, like our own economy, are going to become once again more dependent on the wider world. There's a sort of a shift of power away from the African continent, which is disappointing. It's the reversal of a trend we're working very hard to change around here. But it's also going to be interesting to see which countries are sending aid. So I think it's quite interesting to note how China's been dabbling in the political sphere with its soft aid by sending a whole lot of humanitarian goods and all the rest to Western powers, which is an interesting sort of power play at the moment. But I think that we also have to see what happens with the very big gamble that the US economy has played with basically printing all that cash that we've seen over the last few weeks. But I think it's also got to do with it's not a case of really who's going to be the winner at the end of this, it's who's going to lose least. Because what we're really seeing is, as we do get into more and more debt at a governmental level of just about every country around the world, it really depends on who's the furthest ahead of that field. It's an interesting race to watch, but I think China does have a bit of an advantage being at the front end of this curve as opposed to the back end. But I don't know if this crisis is going to so much change the power balance as accelerate some of the trends that are already in play. And that's very broad, but I'm sure someone else could jump in with some more specifics.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would broadly agree that it feels like this is going to be the moment for Asian power to rise hugely. I would say. I mean, we've yet to see exactly what happens with China's economy, but at least in the short term, that looks to be in a much more robust condition than we'll see many of the Western economies. And I think also something about the fact that, a lot of the Asian nations have just been able to kind of get a grip on the crisis much more quickly. I'm talking about countries like South Korea or Singapore. And so, I mean, they may not be the big power mongers as such, but I just think it just in terms of as a sort of countries to look to that have something to contribute in terms of, a way to organize society, a way to do this much more efficiently. I feel like they've sort of gained hugely in moral authority, as far as I'm concerned. And, countries like the US and the UK, who I think tried to deal with it largely by bluff in the beginning, feel like they've certainly lost credibility in the eyes of their citizens, if nothing else. So.
Let's talk briefly about some of these East Asian countries, because they're not all the same by any means. Some of them seem to have acted quickly with the lockdown, but I think what people are going to find out about South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore is that they were just effective in their governance. It wasn't just what they said, it's what they were able to do. They were able to bring in testing kits quickly. They were able to be sure who was tested and who wasn't tested. And thankfully, at least some of these countries are vibrant, vigorous democracies. So it's not just a case of top-down imposition of power. This kind of fast, agile, effective management of disease might prove to be an example that other governments in the future will want to follow and say, well, let's try and do the same as Taiwan and Korea, or possibly China.
I think New Zealand's also done quite a good job. I think they've also seemed to have been managed to act fast enough. So I think it's not just necessarily, it's not necessarily an East-West thing. It is, as you say, it's a leadership thing. Were leaders able to act on the information? Did they have the political will to act when it was required to act and not too late? So I suppose it comes down to trust, maybe, how people trust their governments. And I think that's probably why perhaps the US and perhaps the UK have not been able to act as fast, because both those countries have been going through a lot of distrust with their political systems. I'm saying that as an outsider, but looking at that, it's like there's not so much of a buy-in between the people and the government. When there are these big fissures in society, you're not able to get things done so much.
I'm speaking as someone based in the UK, I'm less certain it's an issue of trust and more an issue of material ability. I mean, essentially, the UK came into this crisis with 10 years of directly kind of reducing funding to a health service, and before that, kind of 30 years of increasingly trying to marketize its public sector health service. Also, this kind of, I know I sound like a record, but also this kind of utter dependency in the UK on a market economy. So our health secretary, Matt Hancock, was kind of very open about this. And he said, well, we came into this without our own diagnostics testing industry. So therefore, we had no diagnostic tests we could hand out. Well, that's, in my view, a very specific decision to say, okay, well, if people need diagnostic tests, they'll buy them. Right? And a mistake.
Yeah. And I think the other one to look at a little bit is if we talk about having to move to more people being, say, dependent on the state in some ways, so some form of universal basic income. Again, I just wonder whether it would be interesting to look at some societies, in the Nordics, for example. I remember there was a bit of work that we did at the FT a few years ago, looking at how easy it would be to bring in universal basic income in a lot of countries. And in some places that already have quite a high level of public sector support for people, like Finland, it makes only marginal difference to kind of bring something in. In the UK, it's basically unaffordable because the level of state support is so low. You'd have to increase it so much. So and in places like America, virtually, it's just such a big jump. But so whether if we look at all economies being rocked and societies being rocked and the relationship between people and the state changing, I think we may find that some societies are already closer to where we'll have to move to, and maybe at a relative a relative advantage, because they'll be able to take those steps a little quicker. So I'll declare an interest. I'm originally from Finland, so I get a little viewpoint on this. But there's lots of mechanisms already there that have made it quite just a lot easier for people to get that kind of assistance from the state without it being a huge fall in their standard of living, for example. So
Simon, if I can put to you a point that's just been raised in chat by David Chalmers. He says the UK Department of Health and Social Care budget has increased consistently for the last 13 years as a fraction of overall expenditure. So is it just that what was the point you were making? Do you think that it hasn't increased enough, or are there other issues with the lack of capacity?
Essentially, there are a lot of factors which affect the kind of economics of healthcare, right? But what they tend to do is they tend to mean that the costs of your healthcare system go up faster than the general costs across your economy. So even if your healthcare funding goes up in line with inflation, even if it goes up slightly higher than inflation, that tends to not be enough, right? And that's you can explain that just in terms of kind of how productivity increases happen over different sectors of the economy. They tend to happen much slower in very kind of person-intensive sectors like the healthcare sector. And that's before you even kind of get into kind of the fact that you have an aging population, and that changes how you're treating people and that kind of thing. So I would tend to stand by the fact that I think the healthcare system has been consistently underfunded in the UK for the last 13 years, even if spending has gone up.
The change that I personally would like to see most is a switch in how healthcare operates in this country, that it's less about addressing illnesses once they arise and much more about prevention, much more about changing lifestyles and about addressing root causes. Now, this has been talked about for ages. People have said, of course, it would be nice if we were more preventive than just dealing with diseases, but it's never quite happened because of the inertia that's in the system, because of cultural matters as well. But perhaps this crisis, which is leading more people to think, well, how can we avoid getting sick in the first place? What do we need to do to avoid getting sick from this disease? Maybe it's going to swing about a more effective change towards health, which would mean that we could have good health, but while spending less money. But that's my wishful thinking, perhaps.
What's kind of interesting to me on that point, actually, is I increasingly see like a particular section of like UK, US kind of commentariat saying things like, well, lots of people die from flu, and yet we don't shut the economy down. And they tend to say that as though it's obvious that if lots of people die from flu, therefore we should do less about COVID-19, rather than if lots of people dying from flu, why don't we do more about flu? And for me, a fairly kind of simple, one of the personal reflections this has kind of prompted for me is that I had fairly mild but symptoms of coronavirus, and because it was symptoms of coronavirus, I didn't go into work. But had I had the same level of severity of symptoms of flu, I would have still gone into work, even though actually that would then have been a kind of a transmission pathway. And so I think it's partly kind of economic. I feel I have to go into work to be present, but also kind of partly cultural with this kind of Protestant ethic and ethic of presenteeism, right? So those for me are kind of almost in some ways fairly simple shifts you can imagine. So better support for sick pay and allowing people to kind of be off work even if they're not sure that they're really, really ill.
And related to this is whether the free market is good at encouraging the development of vaccines, because vaccines are notoriously very hard to make money out of. You just apply them once if they're really effective, and there's a great deal of trouble in testing them. So most of the large pharmaceutical companies are being shy to get involved in vaccines. Those who did get involved in trying to develop a vaccine for SARS mainly complained that they squandered a lot of money in the process and nothing much came out of it. This may be a case when more central funds have got to be directed into this. There are some things that the free market does pretty well. this looks like it's not one of them.
Just an observation on that. So I think it's been interesting just to note how the big tech philanthropists, particularly in the US, have picked up that cause. Because I think there's, as much as you're saying is a free market challenge to developing those, I think it's also a governmental challenge, because it's something that obviously takes a lot of resources there too. But it seems to me that a lot of the mega charities, like of course your Gates Foundation, all that, are really the ones pushing that vaccine agenda. And maybe that's because they're not correct incentives in place in the public or in the private sector. But generally, you don't find that sort of impetus coming from the NGO sector, definitely not with that sort of cash coming behind it. But definitely something to look at in terms of how to incentivize those things better so that we can get more people working on them.
Yeah, I don't know how you do the incentive side, but I would certainly, what I would really like to see is actually the governments just stay out of all of the kind of the patent pooling stuff, because I think the most disappointing story now looking back on, of the last 10 years was the SARS patent pool that never got off the ground, right? And can you imagine if we'd actually managed to make that work, we would be in a much better position right now, because a lot of the things that they would have developed through that patent pool might now be useful for us now. But what happened, right? Why did the SARS patent pool die? Well, partly it was because SARS never became a big enough problem in the rest of the world. It was mainly confined to Asia and then stamped out, and then everybody sort of lost interest in it. But this patent pool was basically killed by political bickering, and so that's. It actually makes me feel quite angry to think about it. And then the other one that everybody looks at, the medicines patent pool, which is supposedly has been so effective at kind of addressing issues like HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C and that sort of thing. But that was 10 years in the making. All of that is way too slow. Like, that is way too slow for us to use now. So I feel completely despairing when I think about using any of those kind of tried and tested systems to try to address what we need now and what we would need in the future. So I'd love to see something completely new, nothing that we've used before.
So there may be some countries in the world that can show us the way forwards, from which there is less political bickering and more agile mechanisms.
I think it should just be done without the politicians, frankly. I'm going to just put it out there. Like, I think just do not let them get involved. Have it be done by these maker groups or something, but like not people who are going to suddenly, because the point at which these things die is always when people are sort of trying to do things like, decide which countries are allowed to be involved and what should be the pricing and all of these sorts of things. And then the politics comes right back into it, because, so no, basically.
Let's try and take a few more questions before we have to wind up. There's about 12 minutes left before the time that we said we'd finish. This is quite a hard question in some ways, but it's the top one. It's by Neil K. He's asking, could the speakers share their views on what may happen after the immediate lockdown? Will air travel across international borders be restricted? Will lack of competition in the airline industry mean much higher flight prices? Will compulsory vaccination be a requirement in order to get a visa or travel visa-free? Will some sort of app surveillance be a condition of crossing borders? So this is looking shorter term, but I think it's still a very important question. So any of you bold enough to answer with shorter term predictions?
From my perspective, I think yes. I think the golden age of cheap airline travel is in trouble, and not just because of this crisis. As I said, the crisis has accelerated a lot of trends that we've seen. For one thing, airlines around the world, and I know I can speak directly for South Africa too, tend to be subsidized and have been bailed out many, many times. They're marginally profitable. So from a free market perspective, they're not exactly the best businesses to be in. And on the other hand, if you want to look at it more from a collective consciousness point of view, our free transport, our free easy transport around the world on airlines is a huge contributor to climate change and the climate change agenda. So when you sort of combine all these things together, what you find is this crisis has been an accelerant to make us reevaluate just the practicality of airlines and flight tickets. Are we really paying the right price for the externalities we're getting out of it? So I think airline pricing is going to increase in the short term. And then also from a restriction on mobility, I think that's going to be a long-term trend. I don't think that necessarily that the media and politicians that are speaking about that have communicated the fact that our cross-border movements and flows as individuals, as citizens, definitely going to be clamped down on quite a lot in terms of making sure that these sort of diseases don't spread again. We have to remember this caught a lot of the world unaware that these sort of new illnesses are coming out and will come out more frequently as the human population grows. So it's not something that's going to be a one-off thing, and oh, we've had our pandemic for the century, so we can just carry on now. Not at all. I think that this is going to fundamentally get nations to reconsider the free access of travel without those sorts of health checks in place, because the economic cost of not doing so is so absolutely devastating as what we're experiencing right now. I think people are starting to realize those costs have to be factored in terms of both practicalities and the financial costs of travel.
If I can, I'd like to actually kind of challenge the premise of the question a little bit. I tend to, and this actually comes back a little bit to something you said earlier, David, when you said, in your introduction, I think you said we have to be, or maybe it's in the green room, where you said we have to be realists, we kind of have to try and identify what's coming, and we have to not be naive about things. And in a way, I almost want to suggest that we think less about what we think is coming and what the realistic projection is, because I actually think that's quite a dangerous outlook. I think the future is something that we create, and we create it by kind of directly organizing to try and build the things we want to see. And so rather than saying what I think will happen, I might say what I would like to see happen is not a reduction in kind of cross-border movements, but I mean, I got into doing what I do because essentially as a teenager I was very worried about climate change. So I would like to see us build a system where people can move across borders but don't have to do so in the very short timeframes which require flights, essentially. You want an economy, you want a society where you can move, and you can move relatively slowly without losing your livelihood.
It's possible that the outcome of the unwinding of lockdown will depend on whether we're able to reliably know who's infectious and who's not infectious. It may be that there will be some greater mobility again once we are more confident that we can vaccinate people quickly. As I said earlier, currently we're very slow to develop vaccines, but one side effect of this crisis is that some people at least, some startups, are looking at mechanisms for more general vaccines that would work on all coronaviruses or work on all species of flu, for example. So again, the technology might change our options, but I do agree with Simon that we should look also at what kind of future we would like to get out of this rather than just what might be possible.
Because I do think, sorry, just Simon, if you want to go ahead. No, I was just going to jump in to say that I think one scenario I think is entirely possible, but I would really like not to see happen, is the one that Bronwyn raised at the beginning, is the vast increase of inequality. I am worried about that, because if we think about it, almost any of these scenarios, so let's say we take the idea that the airlines collapse and not all of them are reinstated, and it becomes very difficult for us to move across borders, or for the vast majority of us. But I think then I think what we'd end up going back to is that kind of 1970s scenario where the very well-heeled still would be able to travel, right? Because even if we had no airlines, at all, you've got the private jet set, you've got other new technologies coming on, the sort of the electric flying taxi type stuff. And so you'd have a certain subsection of people who would still be able to kind of do all of those things, similarly, who can work at home, and who can't, and who, where again, and I'm taking a sort of technologist's dystopian future, but, if we think about all of the technologies that could come in to replace people that we've found very difficult to live without right now. So massively automating farming even more, the robotic fruit pickers, etc. You get chatbots being used far more for various things in businesses. So so you could end up seeing this big escalation of loss of jobs for some sectors of people, while with the massive increase of relative privilege for others, and that would be brought on by technology. And you can easily see that happening, because all of those things are already there and are seeing accelerated use at this time. So so if we think about what we want to happen, then it's about thinking about ways in which we can. And I'm not saying let's not install another chatbot ever again, but I think it's about thinking how do we not kind of end up restricting the vast majority of people, while still allowing, and then allowing some people to kind of get out of it with this. Anyway, I don't have an answer. I just have questions to pose for everyone.
Well, questions are good. Questions are necessary. We need to find the best questions and spend more time thinking about them. If there's a really good question, we might organize a whole additional conference about that in the future.
Can I just quickly build on that? I wanted to pick up a question or point to a question that came up in the chat in response to what I said. It was Rohit Talwar. He said, and I think it speaks to the point just made actually about like who are the we determining the desired futures that we're talking about. And I think it's super important. I mean, partly because I think this is partly why I think it's a problem to talk about what are realistic futures, because essentially that just reflects the people who are powerful now and what they want to happen. And so I do think like there's a sense in which what I want is to see like 1,000 flowers bloom, right? Rather than kind of seeing the people who have very powerful interests who will try and shut down kind of more imaginative, what I would describe as more humane futures. I want to see these kind of new political groupings emerge out of this kind of crisis and see new distributions of power. But the mention of we and the discussion of power is really important, because there will be people pushing back against new structures. And I guess kind of linked to that was just this question of we also, and it's something I don't do enough either, but I do think it's something that's slightly missing from this, is that like we've really not spoken very much about very poor countries. So when we're talking about kind of air travel in particular, I don't know the precise numbers, but there is something like 80% of the world's population have never taken a flight. So going back to kind of 1970s levels of inequality is not actually kind of hugely different for the majority of the world's population right now.
If we're quick, we might be able to answer 2 more questions. There's a lot of questions who've got 4 votes each. So I'll take one of them in a minute, depends on who else votes for it. But let's try and have very quick answers to this question by Diane Ziliox about the media. So I don't know, at least one of you work in the media. Misinformation and fractured, unreliable media landscapes have contributed to the severity of the pandemic. Do you have any thoughts on the role of the media in the post-coronavirus world?
Yeah, it's a good question. I could probably get on my soapbox.
Please do.
That the sort of the way that social media has fragmented us all into our little bubbles of information, where there isn't really kind of widespread watching of the same news by people. There's a huge distrust of kind of national newspapers, which are seen, I think, quite rightly in some cases as being in the pockets of those in power. So it's difficult for them to argue that yes, everybody should be watching this. On the other hand, how difficult is it proving to sort of disprove some of the conspiracy theories that are going out there and that are just proliferating through social media about 5G and exacerbating coronavirus and what have you. I mean, this seems very little mechanism to do that, even if you get Facebook and Twitter on board with trying to stamp some of that out. It just feels like they're just putting out hundreds of local fires without much effect. I don't know. I feel a little bit like we I do kind of find myself wishing for a way that we could have a more kind of unified media in some senses. Just if I think about I have kids and they don't watch the mainstream news at all. They get all their news from social media. So I kind of realized early on in the crisis, for example, that they just simply weren't aware of the same things about the rules of lockdown, for example. And I found myself having to kind of explain things to them over and over again, stuff that I thought had been vastly out there and was, almost boring to me with its repetition, and that hadn't really crossed their threshold at all. And that really alarmed me. And it made me kind of realize just how kind of dissociated all of this has become now. So yes, I'm really worried about it. I don't know what we do. I think the mainstream media doesn't have a lot of trust, but the social media is all over the place. So
do you think people are respecting the BBC more than before?
Well, I mean, certainly it's like it's at least one, sort of single place to find your news. And for good or ill. I mean, I don't know. I wonder whether, I mean, a lot of times people, certainly during the Brexit debate, we spent a lot of time worrying about BBC bias. But at the moment, it feels like all that sort of subtlety has kind of gone. And it's like you just really want to know one place where you can find, sort of an accurate-ish report on what the latest government advice is, or, and that has an inherent value.
Anybody else got comments on the media? Any of you see grounds for optimism about some of the media becoming more trusted and more central?
I suppose I speak from a personal viewpoint as somebody who doesn't really consume much kind of mainstream media anymore. And to be honest, that has come about for me because I actually think the media was not kind of fragmented enough. I think there was in general a very one very strong story on kind of, for me particularly, how the economy works, and then the rest of fragmentation is around kind of social issues, which, while interesting, are not my primary interest. And I think that actually leads from the BBC, from my point of view, to very kind of biased reporting, in as much as the way they frame their stories. So as we're seeing around coronavirus, the way these stories are kind of framed, it comes from a very kind of specific political position, which is essentially kind of liberal centrism, and that restricts their analysis of how we got here and where we'll go. And frankly, I find that they have sort of very little to say, and what I would like to see is more fragmented media rather than less.
Let's take one more question then in the last few minutes. Question from Jose Cordero. Do you think this pandemic will lead to the creation of new international organizations, something like the creation of the United Nations, and by the way, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, other Bretton Woods organizations, after the terrible trauma of World War II? Is world leadership ready for the future? Or are we going to muddle along the same as currently?
Well, my answer to that would be the current global bodies that we've got aren't necessarily the ones that have done the best jobs in this particular crisis. I would say that a lot of those international bodies have actually let the world down more than anything else. So I think it's a difficult question to answer. I don't know if the public trust would be there for a lot more of those institutions who currently do have a trust deficit, definitely within your emerging markets. I'm not sure what the situation is in the UK there, but I think that there'd have to be a very good reason for the general global public to trust in the emergence of another sort of body. I saw a different view from another group of futurists earlier this week, where they're saying that perhaps there's going to be emergence rather of a more of a medical response team, almost like your Red Cross, a more private sector, more organic sort of global initiative that could step up, coming back to this whole idea of mutual economies and more social solidarity. There could be volunteer organizations that are cross-border that would be prepared to deal with this. But coming back to the global bodies, I'm not sure the world's ready for another one right yet.
Anybody else want to speak up for a new global body or for new distributed communities of makers?
Well, can I just put one scenario out there, which I think, yes, we could be right for a new global body, but we in the West are not going to like that, because it would be led by China. And I think we've got to fall a lot further before we're willing to kind of countenance that. I think that sort of idea would be very abhorrent at the moment. The US certainly wouldn't want to give up its leading position and so on. But it depends on how bad it gets. I mean, if you get to a scenario such as after the Second World War, where you had to rebuild all the economies of Europe, and the US led that effort, then the US, through doing that, gained a huge amount of say over in sort of gained its global leadership position. If we were in that scenario and it was China that bailed everybody out, then yes, we would end up with a sort of China-centric global body. Absolutely.
You said it would have to be led by China. Why couldn't it be led by the EU?
Because I don't think that we would. I think, well, I suppose it could be, but I think China's economy will be stronger. So I'm afraid I probably still, cling on to my sort of capitalist views. But I do think that whoever's got the most money to bail out people usually gets to call the shots, and that's certainly been the case ever since the Second World War in favor of the US. I wonder whether that changes.
Do you believe the economic statistics for China?
Well,
maybe there's huge amounts of hidden debt in the system.
It's possible, but I just think it almost depends on how low the rest of the economies are brought by this.
Anybody else got final comments?
I would say in that regard that I think the US can get through this still ahead of the pack. That's not to say they're going to be the biggest winner in this situation, but rather that perhaps that the horizon of the sort of US era might have shrunk a little bit, but I'm not sure that it's shrunk enough that China will be in a position to overtake them just yet. So that's probably a bit further ahead if you're going to get China-led bodies and all the rest of it. I'm not sure it's in the next 5 to 10 years.
Is that a US led by Trump or a US led by Bill Gates and other philanthropists like him who are doing what arguably the government should be doing?
Aren't they already?
Simon, any final thoughts from you as we wind down? What would you like people to bear in mind as they go away from this session?
What I really like people to bear in mind or to do going away from this session is to think about how they organise locally for the kind of future they want to see. To think about taking this beyond a kind of an interesting discussion of what might happen, and to think critically and concretely about what they can do to make that happen.
Many thanks. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for bravely stepping forward into an area in which there are no easy answers, or the easy answers are almost certainly wrong. So thanks for them for being bold to set the discussion. The discussion can continue in a chat for a while longer. I'll stop the broadcast in a few minutes. Before I do that, I'll just mention we have more London Futurists events coming up. You can find them either by visiting London Futurists on Meetup, or some of them at least you can find via the Crowdcast link. So if you click on, I think it's the thing at the top, follow me on Crowdcast, David Wood, you will see another Crowdcast page for an event we are holding on Monday the 20th of April about seeing through technology hype. That one of the difficulties in foreseeing the future is too many of us get too easily misled by smoke and mirrors of technology companies. We're not quite sure what to believe, and we too easily believe it. But if we have wisdom, as the various panelists in that event are going to advocate, then we can see more clearly to the good future that technology can help us to build, which could actually be significantly different from the world today. So that's something you can find online. Please keep an eye on London Futurists for other sessions. And I want to thank you all for being patient enough. There are still 78 of you online, which is a high percentage. Drop a note in the comments if, for example, you might have been prepared to pay a small fee to attend this, because I can see that my Crowdcast billing is going up. If you would be prepared for a future event to pay maybe £2 or £3 to register, or whether that's a non-starter in the present time. So thanks to everybody, and let's continue to do the best we can to get a better perspective on this future. Thanks all.